Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're stepping into the strategic classroom to unpack one of the most absolutely fascinating what-ifs in military history. We're looking at the 1962 Sino-Indian War. But, we aren't just going to rehash the ground battles. Instead, we're analyzing a massive, literal game-changing capability that India possessed, but deliberately chose to leave sitting on the bench.
Okay, let's dive into this. Picture the Himalayas, right? It's the autumn of 1962. Down on the freezing, rugged ground, Indian soldiers are locked in desperate mountain warfare against heavily outmatching Chinese forces. But if those same soldiers had looked up, the skies were completely empty. No warring jet engines providing cover, no bombs dropping on enemy supply lines, nothing. So it begs the question, what happens when a military has a distinct, overwhelming advantage in a domain, in this case the air, but political and strategic decisions keep that tool locked tight in the toolbox while a war is being lost? To figure that out, we're going to systematically break this down. We'll cover the unused weapon, the escalation dilemma, intelligence versus reality, the mountain battlefield, and wrap up with joint warfare lessons. Part 1. The unused weapon.
Now, the sheer irony of this conflict is the incredible hand India held, but just flat out refused to play. Think about what air power actually does in a war. The Indian Air Force was entirely capable of executing close air support, which is basically dropping ordnance directly on enemy troops to help out friendly forces on the ground. They could do interdiction, meaning they could destroy enemy roads and supply lines deep in the mountains. They had photographic reconnaissance, and, of course, transport. But out of all these dynamic, war-altering options, the Indian government strictly authorized just one: transport. The Air Force was allowed to drop supplies to isolated troops, sure, but any offensive action was strictly forbidden. And this hesitation, it really crippled the defense, playing out agonizingly over several months. As early as May 2nd, the director of military operations actually recommended using offensive air power to balance out the severe troop disadvantages in places like Ladakh. But weeks pass. Finally, on May 25th, the cabinet sanctions its use, but with a massive string attached. Aircraft absolutely cannot cross the line of control. Then, as tensions peaked on October 20th, the Prime Minister issued orders expressly prohibiting fighter aircraft from flying within 15 miles of the international border. So the closer the conflict got, the tighter that political leash became.
Which brings us to Part 2, the escalation dilemma.
You're probably wondering, why on earth would leadership deliberately restrict their own forces right in the middle of a war? Well, on one side of the scale, you had dire, desperate requests from army commanders on the ground, literally begging for close air support to halt the Chinese advance. But on the other side, a paralyzing fear of escalation. The government was terrified that if India used fighter jets, China would retaliate by bombing massive Indian population centers, places like Calcutta or Delhi. And this fear was heavily reinforced by the U.S. ambassador, John Kenneth Galbraith. He strongly advised the Indian government against using offensive air power, arguing it would provoke a massive Chinese retaliation that neither India nor the U.S. could defend against.
So let's look at Part 3, intelligence versus reality. What's really fascinating here is the staggering gap between what the Intelligence Bureau reported and, well, actual reality. The director of the Intelligence Bureau provided an assessment that painted a truly terrifying picture. They claimed China could field almost its entire force of nearly 4,000 aircraft against India, including night interceptors and Soviet-supplied MiG-21s. Sounds incredibly scary, right? But the reality? The intelligence completely ignored the severe altitude penalty of operating from Tibetan airfields. Up there in the thin air, aircraft can hardly carry any weapons or fuel. Furthermore, post-war reports confirmed the Chinese had 0 MiG-21s at the time, no night fighters, and critically, absolutely 0 combat aircraft deployed in Tibet. That phantom threat of a massive aerial bombardment? It was entirely a mirage.
To put that into perspective, let's look at the hard numbers side by side. The Indian Air Force had 559 modern fighters available. We're talking top-tier subsonic jets like Hunters and Gnats. Did they have night interception capability to defend their cities? Yes, actually, 2 full squadrons of Vampire night fighters. Now let's look at the PLA Air Force in Tibet. 0 total fighters deployed for this operation. 0 night interception capability. The Indian Air Force didn't just have an edge here. They had absolute uncontested dominance in the region. If they had been committed into action, they would have literally had a free run in the tactical battle area. And it's not like the IAF was just sitting around waiting. They were fully primed and ready to strike. As early as May, without even getting specific directions from the Ministry of Defense, the Air Force saw the threat and independently took action. They recalled their fully operational pilots. They drew up comprehensive counter-air and interdiction plans. They established forward air controllers and were actively flying standing patrols with hunters and vampires. The weapon was loaded, aimed, and ready to fire. It just needed the political trigger to be pulled.
Now, for part 4, the mountain battlefield. Let's picture the terrain and what the Air Force could have actually done if that trigger had been pulled. Ambassador Galbraith and others kind of assumed the Chinese army had this light logistics footprint, moving invisibly through the forest at night. But the reality on the ground was vastly different. The Chinese had sustained large forces in Tibet for a year to fight Khampa rebels. Because of that, they relied heavily on all-weather roads capable of taking large vehicles, especially these lateral roads stretching right through the Tsangpo Valley down to the McMahon Line. These long, winding logistical threads through the mountains were absolutely textbook targets for Indian fighter bombers. Just a few well-placed strikes in those bottlenecks could have entirely starved the advancing Chinese troops of supplies and ammunition.
Finally, part 5, joint warfare lessons.
So, what does this all mean? What's our ultimate takeaway? Well, the 1962 conflict is a tragic masterclass in the disastrous consequences of siloed operations. You had the Army begging for air support. You had the Air Force completely ready to provide it. You had politicians making decisions based on deeply flawed intelligence bureau reports. And the crazy part? None of them were talking to each other effectively. In early crucial meetings about evicting the Chinese, the Chief of Air Staff wasn't even invited. Later on, the Prime Minister even drafted a letter to U.S. President John F. Kennedy asking for 12 squadrons of American fighters to be flown by American pilots to protect Indian cities, all seemingly without even consulting the Indian Air Force about their own capabilities. It's wild. But it brilliantly illustrates why modern warfare requires the seamless, integrated communication of Army, Air, and intelligence branches, all working from the exact same sheet of music.
So, the absolutely crucial point we're left with is this. Having the best equipment, the bravest pilots, and total numerical superiority, it means absolutely nothing if political fear and intelligence failures keep them grounded. It forces us to ask, how often in history, or heck, even in our own organizations today, do we possess the exact tools needed to win, but we talk ourselves right out of using them? Capability creates advantage only when correctly employed. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.